When we talk about Final Fantasy's identity, what exactly do we mean by that? Obviously, the first things that come to mind are the story and the characters, and of course, there's going to be some fun combat in it as well. But when we think about its identity and we think about it going forward, what do we really mean by it? What's going on, Failroaders? I'm Joshua Thomas, and I want to talk about what Final Fantasy XVII could likely be like whenever it does come out, and what we could expect to see in the first trailers. Obviously, we're going to see some really awesome artwork for characters, and some really good graphics, and some story elements. But what about the combat system? You see, not just in any Final Fantasy game, but in any franchise, there is this combat system, and when people think of it like, say, God of War, you're probably thinking of this really intense and brutal combat system. Or if I was to say Horizon Zero Dawn, you would immediately think about this completely alternate way of interacting with the game. And that's part of what this combat system is about. It's how does the player interact with the game itself. Combat is a pretty big one, and I believe every Final Fantasy kind of has two combat systems. So for the first 10 Final Fantasy mainline games, we had some form of ATB or turn-based system. You're going to hear that a lot. And then after that, we got into our first MMORPG, and then it started to stray further away from this turn-based system or the ATB system. After Final Fantasy XI, they came up with some pretty crazy names like Conditional TB or Active Dimension Battle, and it just started to stray further and further away from the origins. And this was also a time where the gaming industry was changing, and yeah, action-oriented games were becoming more popular. And it seemed at this point like turn-based games were becoming a way of the past. I know that's a different thing that we look at nowadays. We certainly see that there is a place for turn-based games in the gaming market, but back then it was up in the air. It really was. And so Square Enix decided to experiment, and of course Final Fantasy games are all about experimenting with new ways of playing with them. But I would kind of consider these like the moody teenage years of Final Fantasy XII and XIII. And then as we got to 15, it started to get better. They kind of figured themselves out to an extent. And then we had the remake trilogy start with Final Fantasy VII Remake. And then we got Final Fantasy XVI, which strayed the furthest away from any kind of turn-based system in pretty much going very action-oriented. It was this very action reflex-based system. A lot of fans say that the identity is no longer what it should be, and you guys might be thinking, he's going to say how modern-day Final Fantasy should go back to turn-based. Well, don't get your hopes up too just yet. Let's talk about combat systems in Final Fantasy now. So once again, I said there's two combat systems in each Final Fantasy. There's the meta system, such as whether it's turn-based or ATB or something else like the style change ATB. But then there's also this, what I'm going to call the world system, such as Materia or Junction or the job class. So what's the difference between these two things? Well, the meta system is something that the characters aren't aware of, and the world system, such as Materia, once again, is something that the characters know about. They know that they are equipping Materia to their weapons and their armor. They know how Materia works, but they don't realize that they're standing in a line with 3 people in a battle, taking turns fighting the enemy when their ATB charges up enough. So that's how we're going to differentiate between these two things. And pretty much every Final Fantasy has had these two systems. The meta, the turn-based and ATB, are what a lot of people identified as Final Fantasy, like core Final Fantasy. But then after that, we had the Esper system in Final Fantasy VI. We had the job class system in Final Fantasies 3 and 5 and some other ones. And then in Final Fantasy X, we had the Sphere Grid system, which I don't know if the characters were really aware of the Sphere Grid, but they were gaining abilities through these means. And then you skip all the way to Final Fantasy XVI and some of the later Final Fantasies, which don't necessarily have a specific name for their combat systems, especially the newer ones. But we get into this, once again, action reflex system where you are basically mashing buttons to do combos and reacting to enemy attacks by dodging at the right time. So where does this leave us for Final Fantasy XVII? Now, there have been a lot of things going on in recent history, such as Clair Obscur Expedition 33, and the fact that that dev team met with Square Enix's dev teams. Who knows what happened behind closed doors, but does this mean that Final Fantasy is going right back to turn-based? I don't think that's any guarantee whatsoever. I don't believe that just because these two development teams had a meeting means that, oh boy, we're going to get back to turn-based, and I don't necessarily think that we should all be excited about the prospect of that either. Final Fantasy is all about innovation, and I feel that it's less likely for them to go back to turn-based for their mainline series, but I also think that if they were to do that, they would be skipping out on this system, this incredible combat system that they created, and that is what I'll lovingly call the hybrid system. It is both action and both this sort of ATB combat system. And why do I say that they'd be missing out on this? Well, first off, it's just an incredible system to begin with. But as I would watch other videos of other content creators talking about how they were hoping things would go back to this turn-based system, I read many of the comments, and many of the comments were saying, I want to be able to control all the characters. You can do that with Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat system. You can do that with the hybrid system, which is something that 15 skimped out on its original version, and Final Fantasy XVI just completely got rid of. They want to be able to strategize. In other words, they want to be able to choose their commands wisely and use them. You can do that in this hybrid system. And while it may not be a full pause on combat, just like the ATB systems of old, it is an amount of time that you have in order to choose your next attack. And honestly, you can take all the time you need in these ATB systems. It's just that the enemy is not going to wait for you to choose it. When their ATB gauges fill, they're just automatically going to attack you as well. So what's another thing that they wanted? Well, they wanted the strategy aspect of these RPGs to come back, and that is definitely something that I will say that I also missed in Final Fantasy XVI. I really missed having elemental affinities and having status bonus effects and status ailments. I feel like it was just missing, and something that they could have implemented, especially elemental affinities and weaknesses and that kind of thing, because it felt stale after a while. While Final Fantasy XVI's combat was beautiful and flowing, it was also lacking in motivation to strategize. It was basically just like, hey, have you found the movesets that are your favorite and that you're most comfortable using? Okay, well, there's really no reason to change whatsoever. Just keep using those until the end of the game. Whereas if they had implemented elemental effects, then Shiva and Ifrit and Titan and Ramu, all those different abilities would have meant something a little bit more, and there would have been a motivation to change to these different abilities and these different icons, more so than, oh well, I'm shooting red magic, now I'm shooting blue magic, now I'm shooting green magic. So that was definitely something that they missed out on. For Final Fantasy XVII, the future of Final Fantasy, I believe, is in this hybrid system from the remake series. And before you guys say, well no, that's too much remake, like I think of the remake when I think of that, Imagine what it would have been like if Final Fantasy I had come out and people were like, oh no, we shouldn't stick with turn-based. Turn-based is what I think of Final Fantasy I as having. So yeah, I think this hybrid system would be the perfect system moving forward. It has the flexibility of being able to be this awesome combat system that allows you to attack and dodge and parry and guard all the stuff that the enemy is doing, but it also slows down so much so that it gives you all the time in the world to be able to choose your next moves and figure out what you want to do. Or if you just want to use a hotkey to keep the action flowing, you can do that as well. But it goes a step further. There's the classic mode available in both Remake and Rebirth, and it essentially turns the game into just a flat-out ATB system. You are sitting there, all you're doing is waiting for the ATB gauge to fill, and then you're choosing your commands. That's what a lot of people want in their turn-based games. The only difference is the characters are dynamically moving around the battlefield, guarding and attacking on their own, yes, but let's be honest, out of all the things that you could do in all the original Final Fantasy games, a regular attack was probably the most boring, least thrilling thing you could do. So, am I right? Am I wrong? Am I somewhere in between? Let me know what you guys think in a comment. I don't think that turn-based is necessarily the future of Final Fantasy, or that it could somehow magically save Final Fantasy, and in fact, if you're not playing modern-day Final Fantasies solely because they're not turn-based, you could be missing out on some very incredible gaming experiences. Nevertheless, I want to hear your thoughts. What do you guys think about the hybrid system from the Remake series? What do you guys think about other combat systems? And do you enjoy my breakdown of how different Final Fantasies have technically 2 combat systems? Let me know in a comment below, and let me know what you think the identity of Final Fantasy XVII is going to be. Thanks for watching. Check you guys next time.